Beneath the dazzling blue waters off Florida's east coast, sunlight flickers through the waves like liquid gold. The ocean here looks peaceful, but beneath that shimmering surface lies a centuries-old mystery, one that has lured explorers, dreamers, and treasure hunters for generations. For most beachgoers, this stretch of shoreline is just another postcard-perfect paradise. But locals know it by a different name, the Trenton Coast. A name born not from fantasy, but from real gold found and lost over the span of 300 years. Our story begins one humid July morning, when a small team of divers prepared their gear near Sebastian Inlet. The air buzzed with anticipation. They weren't thrill-seekers chasing myths, they were seasoned explorers, armed with high-tech sonar scanners, historical maps, and an unshakable belief that something extraordinary still waited beneath the sand. Little did they know, that belief was about to pay off in a way no one expected. As they descended into the water, visibility was murky and green, the kind of underwater world where shadows could play tricks on your eyes. But then, one diver's metal detector began to beep. Once, twice, then rapidly. A rush of adrenaline surged. He dug his gloved hand into the seabed, brushing away layers of silt, and there it was. A small, gleaming coin, barely the size of a thumbnail, but unmistakably gold. He signaled the others, bubbles rising wildly as they gathered around. Moments later, they uncovered another coin, then another, and then, half buried in coral, the unmistakable curve of a Spanish treasure chest. When the divers surfaced, gasping and shouting with excitement, they knew this wasn't just another small find. What they'd just discovered would soon make headlines across America: $1 million worth of lost Spanish treasure, hidden for centuries just off Florida's coast. But where had it come from? And how could gold from the Age of Empires end up here, resting quietly beneath a modern beach town? That answer takes us back to the early 1700s, when a convoy of ships known as the Spanish Treasure Fleet met a storm so fierce it would scatter gold across the sea and carve the legend of the Treasure Coast forever into history. The year was 1715, and the Spanish Empire was at the height of its power. Every summer, fleets of galleons, massive wooden ships, creaking under the weight of gold, silver, and jewels, would set sail from the New World, bound for Spain. These weren't ordinary cargo ships. They carried the wealth of entire colonies. Each vessel held the spoils of a vast empire: coins minted from Peruvian mines, silver bars from Mexico, emeralds from Colombia, and artifacts collected from the Caribbean islands. The route was dangerous, but for Spain, it was worth the risk. Those treasures funded wars, royal palaces, and the empire's expansion across the globe. In July of that year, a fleet of 11 ships left Havana, Cuba, under clear skies. They were heavily armed and confident, escorted by soldiers and guided by the most skilled navigators of their time. On board were families of merchants, priests, and sailors who had spent months in the colonies and were finally returning home. But within days, as they approached the Florida coast, the weather turned treacherous. What began as a light wind quickly grew into a monstrous hurricane. Waves taller than houses crashed against the wooden hulls. Masts splintered, sails tore like paper. For the sailors, there was no hope, only chaos and prayer. One by one, the mighty galleons were ripped apart and swallowed by the storm. In the blackness of night, men clung to debris, clutching gold coins that suddenly meant nothing in the fight to survive. When morning came, the sea was littered with wreckage and silence. The 1715 Spanish treasure fleet was gone, claimed by the Atlantic just off the coast of what is now Vero Beach, Florida. But the tragedy didn't end there. In the months that followed, survivors starving and desperate washed ashore. Spanish authorities organized recovery missions, salvaging what they could from the shallow waters. They found chests of gold and silver scattered across the seabed, but much of it was never recovered. Over the centuries, hurricanes, tides, and sand buried the rest deep beneath the ocean floor, turning that coastline into one of the most mysterious treasure zones in the world. Even now, locals say that after big storms, coins still wash up on the sand, small glimmers of gold that remind everyone of the empire that fell beneath the waves. And that's what draws modern divers back. Generation after generation, the promise that somewhere down there, untouched for 300 years, lies a fortune waiting to be rediscovered. Fast forward to the modern day, 3 centuries after that deadly storm. The same stretch of coastline that once swallowed 11 galleons is now lined with condos, fishing piers, and beach resorts. Tourists tan under umbrellas, completely unaware that beneath their feet lies a sunken kingdom of gold. But for treasure divers, every dive along Florida's Treasure Coast is like stepping into history. Beneath the calm waves, the past still breathes quietly, patiently, waiting to be found. Our team of divers experienced explorers, with years of searching behind them, had studied every tide chart, every shipwreck map, every weather log. They weren't just guessing. They were following the precise trails left behind by the 1715 fleet. Each coin, each artifact recovered in previous years, helped narrow their search. And on that particular morning, something felt different. The ocean was calm, the water clear, and their instruments were picking up readings stronger than they'd ever seen before. As they descended, beams of sunlight danced through the turquoise water, slicing through schools of fish. The diver leading the group moved slowly, sweeping his metal detector in wide arcs. The first beep made his heart pound. He dug into the sand and unearthed a silver coin tarnished, but still sharp enough to reveal the crest of Spain's royal seal. Another signal nearby. This time, it was gold. Then another. Within minutes, they were uncovering an entire scatter pattern, exactly what happens when a wooden chest breaks apart underwater and its contents drift with a current. The divers couldn't believe what they were seeing. The seafloor glittered faintly, as if the sun itself had shattered and fallen into the ocean. They began collecting coins, one by one, carefully marking the site for archaeologists and marine historians to verify. But when one diver brushed away a clump of coral and uncovered a curved metal, latch the kind used to seal treasure chests, the team froze. Could it really be one of the lost chests from 1715? Back on the surface, adrenaline gave way to awe. They laid the coins out carefully on a weathered wooden table, the salt water still dripping from their gloves. Each coin bore the mark of history hand-hammered designs, the Spanish cross. And the year 1715, the gold shimmered in the morning light, untarnished by 3 centuries underwater. And in that moment, every diver knew they hadn't just found treasure, they had touched a piece of time. But what came next would surprise even the most seasoned experts, because this discovery was indeed just about gold. It was about unlocking a mystery that had haunted historians for generations, a secret hidden in the ship's final voyage itself. When news of the discovery broke, it spread across Florida like wildfire. Local radio stations called it the find of the decade, and by sunset, major networks were reporting live from the coastline. Crowds gathered near the divers' boats, eager to catch a glimpse of the glittering coins that had slept beneath the sea for 300 years. But as experts arrived to examine the treasure, the story grew deeper than anyone expected. These weren't random coins from a scattered wreck. They all carried identical mint marks, identical dates, and identical symbols. That meant one thing: they likely came from the same ship. And not just any ship, but one that had long been the center of a historical puzzle, the Nuestra Señora de las Nieves, a vessel said to carry one of the richest private treasures ever shipped from the New World. Historians had debated for decades whether the Nieves ever truly existed, or if it was simply a legend passed down through Spanish maritime records. But the pattern of the coins, their weight, purity, and engravings matched the documents perfectly. Suddenly, a centuries-old myth was becoming tangible reality, right there in the hands of a group of divers who had only set out for a routine search. Archaeologists moved in quickly to secure the site. Using underwater drones and magnetic scanners, they mapped out a debris field stretching nearly half a mile across the ocean floor. The data showed broken timbers, cannon fragments, and metallic objects that could be chests, weapons, or navigational tools. Every piece told a story of violence and survival of men fighting to save their cargo as the hurricane tore their ship apart. For the divers, it was surreal. They had trained their entire lives for moments like this, but nothing prepares you for the instant you realize you're holding history in your hands. And yet, amid all the excitement, there was something sobering about the discovery. Those gold coins weren't just currency. They were relics of real people, sailors and families who had vanished into the storm. Each coin represented someone's life, someone's story lost to the sea. As the sun set over the Atlantic that evening, the waves rolled softly against the shore. The Treasure Coast had given up another piece of its past, but only just enough to remind everyone that the ocean never reveals everything at once. And the mystery of how so much gold ended up in that exact spot, so far from the main wrecks, was about to unravel into something far more astonishing than anyone imagined. In the weeks that followed, the site became a controlled excavation zone. Marine archaeologists, historians, and government officials worked side by side with the original dive team, piecing together the fragments of the ship that time had scattered. Each dive brought up something new: rusted cannonballs, shards of fine porcelain, even the remains of a navigational astrolabe, its brass surface still etched with faint celestial markings. But then, amid the sand and coral, they discovered something that would change everything: a small wooden plank, preserved unusually well, bearing the hand-carved initials FM. At first, it seemed insignificant. But when compared to the Spanish shipping manifests from 1715, those initials matched Francisco Mendoza, a wealthy merchant who had chartered a portion of the fleet to carry his private fortune back to Spain. Legend claimed Mendoza had secretly loaded his gold aboard one of the ships to avoid paying royal taxes to the crown, a daring act of defiance that, if true, meant this treasure wasn't just royal property, it was smuggled wealth. Historians now began to suspect that the treasure the divers had found wasn't part of Spain's official cargo at all. It was part of Mendoza's hidden fortune: millions in gold, meant to vanish from the empire's records forever. And in a cruel twist of fate, it had indeed vanished, just not in the way he intended. The storm had sealed his secret beneath the waves for centuries, leaving behind whispers of betrayal, greed, and ambition buried with the gold. For the divers, this revelation turned their discovery from an exciting find into a historic breakthrough. They weren't just uncovering treasure, they were rewriting history. The story of the 1715 fleet wasn't only about disaster, it was about deception, forbidden wealth, and one man's gamble that nature itself had silenced. As the team carefully lifted another gold chalice from the seabed, sunlight caught the rim and cast a beam of light through the water. It was as if the ocean itself was finally telling its side of the story, slowly, piece by piece. On shore, museums and news anchors began calling the discovery the ghost fortune of Mendoza. But one question remained unanswered, one that still haunts divers to this day. If Mendoza's treasure was found here, where was the rest of it? Because according to the manifests, only a fraction of his gold had been recovered. And that question would lead the divers to a clue hidden not in the ocean, but on land buried deep in the archives of Florida's oldest town, 200 miles north, in the quiet cobblestone streets of St. Augustine. Florida, the oldest European settlement in the United States, retired historian named Eleanor Ruiz was flipping through fragile Spanish naval ledgers when she saw something strange. The records for the 1715 fleet were supposed to be consistent, but one page didn't match. It listed a merchant's supplemental cargo, gold coins, chalices, and jewelry, but no ship name, just a cryptic note beside it. Offloaded before departure. Destination unknown. For most researchers, it would have been an odd footnote, but for Eleanor, who had followed the fleet's story her entire career, it was the missing puzzle piece. She reached out to the dive team, sharing her discovery a clue, suggesting that not all of Francisco Mendoza's fortune ever made it onto the doomed galleons. Some of it, it seemed, had been secretly hidden on shore before the storm even struck. The divers and historians met in a small coastal cafe in Sebastian, spreading out maps, archival photos, and tide charts across the table. The theory forming between them was almost unbelievable. What if part of the treasure fleet wasn't lost at sea at all, but buried intentionally along the Florida coast as a safeguard? A backup cache, hidden while the rest of the ships prepared to sail. If that was true, then centuries of search efforts had been looking in the wrong place entirely. Driven by curiosity and adrenaline, the team began exploring inland sites near the Sebastian and Vero Beach areas, places that might have been accessible in the early 18th century, when much of the coastline looked vastly different. Using ground-penetrating radar, they scanned dunes and old riverbeds. For days, nothing appeared, just shells, driftwood, and sand, until, one afternoon, one of the scanners lit up. Beneath the shifting dunes, about 5 feet down, was a shape too clean to be natural, a rectangular outline roughly the size of a chest. They dug carefully, layer by layer, until the wooden edge appeared, darkened and brittle from age. The team fell silent, cameras rolled. With one final brush of sand, they uncovered the rusted iron latch and hinges. When they pried it open, the sunlight hit a dull reflection gold coins, stacked like scales, strands of pearls, and a crucifix encrusted with emeralds. The air was thick with disbelief. After 300 years, they had found what no one even knew existed: Mendoza's hidden cache, the fortune he tried to keep from the empire. Buried so close to home that history had simply forgotten it. The discovery shook the archaeological world. This wasn't just lost treasure, it was living proof that parts of the Spanish fleet's riches never even set sail. And as word spread, experts began rethinking everything they thought they knew about the 1715 disaster. But with great discoveries come greater consequences. What happened next would test the divers' loyalty, their ethics, and even their safety, because not everyone wanted this story to be told. At first, the divers thought their hardest work was over. They had made history-found treasure that had eluded generations, and solved one of the great maritime mysteries of the New World. But within days, the atmosphere shifted. Calls began coming in from private collectors, lawyers, even government representatives, each with their own claim over the discovery. Under U.S. law, shipwreck finds within state waters could fall under complex salvage rules, especially if they were tied to a sovereign nation. Spain, too, had a say, asserting that since the treasure belonged to its colonial Lira fleet, it remained Spanish property. Reporters swarmed the beach, their cameras flashing as the divers loaded sealed containers of coins and artifacts into secure vehicles for documentation. But behind the excitement, tension simmered. Some locals whispered that modern treasure hunting should stop altogether, that the past should rest where it fell. Others argued the opposite, calling the divers heroes for uncovering Florida's lost history. The coast buzzed with debate, every voice echoing through coffee shops and harborside taverns. Meanwhile, the team faced a moral crossroads. They could hand everything over to the state, as protocol demanded, or they could take their findings to private museums and collectors, where the story might be told their way and where the profits would be immense. One diver, weary from the media chaos, quietly said, "It's like the curse followed us out of the water." And maybe he wasn't wrong. Late one evening, under a soft orange sunset, the lead diver, Mark Henderson, walked the beach alone. In his pocket was one gold coin, still encrusted with sand. He turned it over slowly, tracing the faded crest of Spain's empire. "How many men died for this?" he whispered to himself. In that moment, the weight of the treasure didn't feel like wealth, it felt like memory, like the echo of every life lost to the storm that night in 1715. Over the following weeks, the divers decided to cooperate fully with historians and the Florida state archaeologists. Their mission, they agreed, wasn't to own the treasure, it was to preserve its story. As artifacts were cataloged and transported to conservation labs, the reality set in. Their discovery wasn't just gold, it was history rising from the deep. But just when the dust began to settle, Eleanor Ruiz uncovered something unexpected in the same archive that started it. An unsealed letter, written in fading ink from Mendoza himself, and its contents hinted that there was still more treasure, hidden far beyond the Florida coast. The letter was dated August 2nd, 1715, just days before the fleet's doomed departure from Havana. Its ink was faded, but Eleanor's steady hands traced each looping word with reverence. Mendoza had written to his brother in Spain, confessing his fear that the fleet might never reach home. He mentioned storms gathering in the east and a cryptic line that stopped Eleanor cold. "If I do not return, the rest shall remain where the river meets the sea." That single phrase, "where the river meets the sea," shins shivers down her spine. It wasn't a poetic farewell, it was a set of directions. Eleanor contacted Mark and the dive team immediately, urging them to investigate one final location, the Indian River Lagoon, an estuary system stretching along Florida's treasure coast where fresh and salt water blend together. It was an area few had ever searched, mostly because the sediment and murky waters made diving nearly impossible. But for a team that had already rewritten history, the challenge was irresistible. Days later, they launched their small research vessel under a glowing sunrise. The lagoon was calm, its surface glassy and silent. Mangroves swayed gently as the divers slipped beneath the surface, their lights slicing through the haze of silt. For hours, there was nothing, just sand, roots, and debris. Then, just as hope began to fade, one diver spotted something glinting faintly under a bed of oyster shells, a golden rosary. It was delicate, encrusted with barnacles, but unmistakably from the same era as the 1715 fleet. Excitement surged through the team. They widened their search, and soon more signals echoed through their head-set strong ones. Within minutes, they had uncovered pieces of ornate jewelry, small silver ingots, and an intricately carved crucifix wrapped in what appeared to be ancient cloth. The discovery was breathtaking, but the location changed everything. This wasn't open ocean, it was inland. That meant these artifacts hadn't simply drifted here, they had been placed. Back on deck, Eleanor unrolled a map and pointed to a small inlet near the discovery site. This is where Mendoza's men could have offloaded a portion of his treasure before the fleet set sail, she said quietly. He must have hidden it here waiting to retrieve it once the storm season passed. But fate had other plans. The hurricane came, and Mendoza's secret was swallowed by both sea and time. The divers sat in stunned silence, realizing what they had uncovered. They weren't just finding gold anymore, they were unearthing the final testament of a man who tried to outwit an empire and the ocean itself. The weight of that truth was heavier than any chest of coins. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lagoon shimmered in gold light, mirroring the treasure below. The team knew their discovery would go down in history not as a tale of greed, but as a story of perseverance, legacy, and redemption written across the tides of time. Because in the end, the Treasure Coast had revealed its greatest secret, that sometimes what's truly priceless isn't the gold itself, but the story it tells. Weeks later, the world's eyes turned once again to Florida's Treasure Coast. The divers' discovery, both at sea and in the lagoon, had sparked a wave of fascination, unlike anything in recent history. Museums requested exhibits, universities offered to fund research, and major networks called it one of the most important maritime discoveries of the 21st century. But amid the spotlight and the celebration, the team stayed grounded. They weren't chasing fame, they were chasing truth. In the small coastal museum of Vero Beach, a new exhibit opened, the lost gold of 1715. Behind glass cases, the artifacts gleamed softly under golden light coins, chalices, rosaries, and fragments of wood from the original ship. Visitors stared in awe, their reflections merging with the history before them. But for Mark and Eleanor, who stood quietly at the back of the crowd, the real treasure wasn't in the cases, it was in knowing that they had given voice to the people who vanished with the fleet, and to a man whose ambition had been forgotten for 3 centuries. One evening, after the museum closed, Mark returned alone to the shoreline. The tide was low, the moonlight silvering the waves. He walked to the same spot where the first coin had been found, listening to the rhythmic crash of the sea. In his hand, he held a small artifact recovered from the Laguna fragment of the Golden Rosary, now restored and glinting faintly in the moonlight. He knelt and pressed it gently into the sand, whispering, "This is where you belong." The camera would linger, there the waves rolling in, the distant sound of seabirds, the endless horizon beyond. Because that's what the Treasure Coast truly is, not just a graveyard of ships, but a living story, a place where history and legend blur together, where every grain of sand might hide a secret, and where the ghosts of the past still whisper to those who dare to listen. As dawn rose over the Atlantic, the sunlight once again danced across the water, the same way it had 300 years ago. Somewhere beneath those waves, countless treasures still slept waiting for the next curious soul to come searching. And while gold may fade and empires may fall, the ocean remembers everything. Morning light spills across Florida's coastline, turning the surf into ribbons of gold. The camera drifts over the ocean that hides centuries of stories, waves rolling over invisible wrecks, sunken timbers, and dreams turned to legend. A soft breeze moves through the palms, and for a moment, it feels as if time itself pauses, 300 years of history suspended in a single glimmer of sunlight on the sea. In the quiet that follows, Mark's voice echoes softly in memory. Every coin we found had a heartbeat. He wasn't wrong, because the true value of what the divers uncovered wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in stories. The story of a storm that swallowed a fleet. The story of a merchant who tried to cheat fate. The story of a coastline that never forgot what the ocean took. Eleanor would later write in her journal, "We did not recover gold. We recovered voices." Her words became the final line of the museum's display placard epitaph for the men, women, and dreams lost to the hurricane of 1715, and for every visitor who stands before that glass, gazing at coins that once crossed empires, the silence feels almost sacred. You can hear the faint echo of the surf, the creak of the old wooden decks, the the cry of sailors who never made it home. As the camera rises, we see the entire treasure coast stretching endlessly below sunlight, glittering where the sea meets the sky. Somewhere, beneath those waves, more treasures lie untouched, sealed in sand and silence. But maybe that's how it should be. Some stories belong to history, others belong to the sea. And as the final shot fades, one truth remains: Florida's treasure coast isn't just about what was found, but what was left behind. Because long after the gold loses its shine, the legend will endure, whispered by the waves, carried by the wind, and remembered by those who still believe that beneath every calm surface, the past is waiting to be rediscovered.